I guess I'll ask this one first. So, say for example, if I was to have met young James um, back in the day, just getting to know God, just trying to fit in, swearing in church, whatever, like full of
Not for
enthusiasm,
too long, can I say? I wasn't doing it for too long, but to begin with,
just
I was.
full of enthusiasm.
Yeah.
If I would have told that kid that you're gonna be a pastor in a few years' time, what would the kid have said to me?
Well, firstly, what's a pastor? Um, um, but if you told me that I was going to stand in front of people and speak, if you told me that I would be walking people down the aisle, marrying them, if you told me that I would be helping by God's grace to restore marriages, or to organize youth retreats and conferences, or whatever it may be, and not that all of that is better than anything else, but in that context, if you told me that I would be doing that stuff, I would have said, you're talking to someone that can't even have a one-on-one conversation with you without looking away. I couldn't look a girl in the face without putting my face to the floor because I was that ashamed of myself. And you're telling me that that person who has had no education, so that's the crazy thing. That's why I say I feel like God's providence is so important, because the education that I lost through fear, I now have a theology degree, a master's degree, and about to start a PhD. And like I said, if people don't have that, that's not God's path for them. That's okay. But the fact that I lost all my education, and now I'm moving towards being able to function in that context. Like, if you told me that those things were possible, I would have said, you obviously don't know who you're talking to. Because I'm a 16-year-old kid that's got no education, that can't stand in front of people and hates people looking at him. And now you tell me that my life is going to largely revolve around either speaking publicly, teaching in groups, or helping support and pastor people. That don't make no sense. Like, that's just nonsense. And yet, messy at times, yes, up and down, yes, but yeah, I'm here 25 years later, and I'm able to do some of those things. And yeah, that can't be anything for me other than God. But yeah, it wouldn't have made any sense if you told me that when I was 16 or 17 or even 18. It wouldn't have made no sense.
Right. So the other question I wanted to ask, right. So you mentioned that, sometimes you might swear and stuff like that, but nobody judged you. Right? And that was kind of what helped you in terms of growing your faith.
Yeah.
I guess my question to you now is, do you think that that's the same? Do you think that would be the same testimony that many would have about the church nowadays?
Aye.
Because I'm not so sure.
I would honestly say, you want a completely honest answer from me?
Please.
I would say it depends what part of the church you go to.
Okay.
I think there's aspects of the church denominationally where I think that's less of a worry, where I think you might encounter people that are a lot more patient or understanding. I'm not mentioning names or anything, but I just think generally there are some parts of the church that are very focused on reaching kind of into certain environments, and with that they realistically know what comes with that. But I think that there are contexts of the church where that isn't as present, and where maybe there isn't as much of an understanding of the process it takes to become holy. Or you are holy, but also becoming holy. And I think that the time it takes to do that, I've always found this, I'm a firm believer in the imagery that describes Jesus, where it says that Jesus came in grace and truth. And I think that we love the truth part as Christians sometimes, where we want to tell people everything that's wrong with them. But it also says that Jesus came in grace. And I think that sometimes we need to get better as a church in our grace, in how we live alongside people, how we support people through transformation, because I'm a firm believer that even transformation is messy. I don't think it's clean cut all the time. I've worked in a context of, inner city youth work, recovery, homes, people coming off addiction, and I've seen that transformation is messy. It's not always just one clean journey forward. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, whatever it might be. And I think we have to learn to hold truth and grace together. And we can't just accept anything. Like, that's a dangerous thing. At the same time, if we're going to tell people they need to change, are we willing to live with grace as they change and be with them as they change? And so people called me out on some of my things, but it was never with a judgmental, condemning spirit. It was, listen, there's a better way to do this. And so people gave me truth, but they gave me grace too. And I think as a church, sometimes we get imbalanced. You can have parts of the church that are focused on grace, but don't always value truth. And you can have parts of the church that value truth at all costs, but don't always live with grace. And I think those two things together is what actually births and brings transformation. And if we get imbalanced on either side, I think it's a concern. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think those two things are very important.
I think you said some wonderful things there, Pastor. However, I am gonna push you a little bit on this. If you had to like lean more towards one side, which way would you say? Just in general.
If I have to.
If you had to.
I mean, I don't believe I have to, but if we're pushing me,
yeah,
I have to go, obviously, like with truth, because it's truth that sets us free.
Okay.
And I believe that truth is what enables us to become everything God has called us to become. But I do think that, that without grace is very difficult for people to journey in that freedom. Because, I'm always a firm believer, like with Jesus, man, like his, we talk about the cross, and I'm so thankful for the cross and his resurrection and everything, but sometimes we need to pay a bit more attention to his life as well. And the fact that there were moments and times where for every time he would heal a leper or a blind man or raise the dead, or he would also sit with someone in their house and eat with them and drink with them and talk with them. And I think that's the truth and grace together. But certainly what we can't do at any cost as a church is sacrifice truth, because then we don't really become the kingdom of God anymore. We just become another alternative to the world's way. But I can't lay aside grace. I'm sorry. They have to go together.
Do you know, I was asking you the question about like the church maybe being a bit, well, if someone now would say that the church wasn't so judgmental, because I mean, not that I speak to, but I feel like, well, we kind of live in a different world now where at the same time we need to remember that like almost anything is classed as being judgmental or like being intolerant. So we do kind of need to put that out there. But even with that said, like the churches obviously should be not put to a higher standard, a different standard, but I mean we shouldn't be receiving people the way that the world receives people, or we shouldn't be treating people or make people feel the same way that, or have the same threshold as the world does. But I feel like the church sometimes you could say that the church sometimes we have let, that intolerance kind of thing, or like less patience or less room for grace even. Especially for like, some young people may even feel overwhelmed, or like intimidated when they go into a church. And I think before I let you answer this question of like, do you agree with that? I think you work with a lot of youths, right? As a pastor, right?
Yeah, a little less so now, but for 20
Yeah.
years I was involved either in church or in statutory youth work. Yeah, so still a little bit though, for sure.
Right. So yeah, yeah. I guess in that, well, I was gonna ask you like from your experience, like
Yeah.
have you seen that? Do you think?
I think there's two sides to the coin that has to be looked at. I think on one side, if we go from a church perspective, you've got this pendulum effect, which has worked all through church history, which is where something happens which is maybe not positive, maybe it's not scriptural, or it's maybe what people consider an ungodly way of expressing faith. And so the pendulum effect is, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to resist that and go to the completely opposite spectrum. You've got things like, like aspects of the Reformation and certain early church movements and what have you. And so I think as a church, when we look at ourselves, we have to say, are we swinging too far on one side of the pendulum? Are we so judgmental that we don't give people time to change? We don't give people the grace. Maybe we've forgotten what our transformation looked like. Maybe we've forgotten about our struggles. So we have to first make sure, okay, we're not over there where we are condemning and we are judging before people even have an opportunity to experience God's grace and God's transforming power. On the other side, as a church, we also have to make sure that we don't accept anything. And we're not just saying anything goes, because I'm not a believer in that either. I'm a believer that God is a God of transformation, God's a God of holiness, God's a God of excellence, and whatever word you want to attach to that. But God is a God that has standards and expectations for what it means to be a Christian, to be a believer, to be a part of his kingdom. So on a church level, we have to make sure that we don't swing the pendulum either way too far. On the other side of it, you mentioned it, and I think it is important to mention, we also live in a day and age where if you have a different belief to someone, that is often labeled as being bigoted or judgmental or intolerant or, a hater, whatever language might be attached to it. And we have to accept that actually you can even communicate the gospel in the best way it's ever been communicated, apart from Jesus. You could be the best preacher in the history of the church.
I'm Paul.
And Paul, yeah, of course. And Paul. And James and Peter. Like, after the Bible, you could be like the best communicator that the church has ever seen, and you'll still be hated, and you'll still be rejected, and you'll still be labeled as all these things. You can do everything right. It's not an excuse to not do it as well as we can. It's not an excuse to not be learned and studied and gracious and loving and a listener and all this stuff. But it's to recognize that we live in a generation potentially more than ever, but maybe not, maybe just as equal as certain other generations. But certainly in that context, over the last 50 to 100 years, it's shifted massively. And so we have to accept that as well, is we could do everything right and still be labeled as wrong. And so we have to really take care of our own house and our own doorstep and say, are we getting that balance right? And if we are, it's almost like when God spoke to Ezekiel and he said to Ezekiel, and I always find this really annoying, like I think if I was in that position, God, I'd be like, please no. Where God said to Ezekiel, go and preach to them, go and prophesy to them, go and preach to them, but I'm letting you know now they're not going to listen to you, they're going to reject you, but still preach to them anyway. And sometimes I feel like it's like that a little bit now sometimes, like just because you might not be sure if they're going to listen to you doesn't mean you don't preach the message, doesn't mean you don't live the lifestyle. But yeah, so I think so.
Just to maybe put us just to do an add-on to that, like in terms of like the young people, because I feel like a lot of young people are like maybe not going to church as much or like being involved in church as much because they think it's old-fashioned. Even you hear that a lot nowadays, like it's old-fashioned. Like people come to you and say, how do you follow this thing that was written so many thousand years ago? It's not evolved enough, that kind of stuff, which I think is a bit wild, to be honest, but that's besides the point. Like what do you think the future of like the faith is going? Like, do you think it's in good hands in terms of the young generation and the future generation?
Big question. That's a very big question. I mean, definitely most of the research would suggest that, young people are leaving the church at a faster rate than ever before. And I don't think there's much doubt about that across the board. And that's most denominations, if not all. That's most parts of the body of Christ, if not all, where young people are leaving in droves compared to what they were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Particularly so, they reckon, when it comes to that place of university age, where church becomes optional for those that had to go. All of a sudden they don't have to. And I think with that, I think that the young people's view of the church reflects their view of most things right now. It's, and what? Like, okay, the church was some of this 20 years ago, 50 years ago. But young people aren't just asking that question about the church. They're not just asking, well, what relevance is the church to me? Or what relevance is God to me? Or why should I value the church and all those things? They're not just asking that question about the church. They're asking that question about university. They're asking that question about all different types of things, where everything is just an option now. And so I think that when we look at young people generally, we have to make sure we understand where they're coming from. Us just telling them, yeah, you need church, it's not going to work for them. It's not going to work for them. So we have to meet them where they're at. What is their mentality? What is their attitude towards church, towards God? And I think there's no substitute for certain things. For one, there's no substitute for, and what we can't rely on is just getting young people involved in church. That's not enough. It's positive and it's good, but young people need an encounter with God. Like we've gone back a few times, but we might as well bring him up one more time. Timothy, right? Timothy was raised in the scriptures. He was raised in, you could imagine, doesn't specifically say it, but you could imagine he was raised in an atmosphere of prayer and faith. And that was ultimately the forming of his faith. So whether that's parents or whether that's leaders and shepherds and youth leaders in the church, it's not enough just to get young people involved. How do we create spaces where faith is formed, where encounters with God take place, where the word becomes alive and powerful, sharper than any double-edged sword? How do we create those spaces? And I think if we can create those spaces of encounter and faith and recognize the uniqueness of what we bring as a church, as God's people, if we can do that, then the future of our church is in the best hands it could ever be in. But if we don't do that and we just depend on church, or we just depend on forcing people to be involved, if we just depend on that, then we're not going to have no hands to hand it over to. We're not going to be there. The hands are going to be somewhere else. So I do think that we have, you know, an intelligent, skilled, ambitious generation of young people that want to make a difference. And this is the thing, they want to make a difference in the world. They do. But it's not automatically the church where they do that anymore. And so we need to find a way as God's people that the church as a big part of the answer of how we engage with young people. But the starting point is important. And I think sometimes we get the starting point wrong.
You know what? Yeah, I genuinely feel like a bit stupid trying to add on to like anything you said.
No, go for it, man.
But
just...
do you know with the Timothy story? I think it's quite apparent that we both love Timothy.
Popular today, isn't he? He's popular, man. Come on.
Yeah, I think it's funny because you know, yeah, I got to love Timothy because we did like a study in Timothy, and it came from nowhere. You know, I don't think Timothy is talked about much, but there's a lot in there. There's quite a lot of richness in Timothy. But in terms of you mentioning, like he came from a Christian family, probably.
Yeah.
I think, was it his grandmothers or something were like Christians?
Lewis and Eunice or something like that.
Yeah, like there's women like mentioned anyways. And mention that idea of community, like I think for me personally, and I think in the story of Timothy as well, it may not be said specifically, but it can be implied. It's the idea of you can be sure that those people also prayed for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, and I think that's also a big factor in helping the youth And I feel like one of the biggest reasons why I'm probably here is because of the prayers of like my parents and the church that I was brought up in.
Yeah.
I think that's something that should be highlighted as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think, I came into church when I was 16. And so, no, I didn't grow up in church, but I was still pretty young. And I came into the church at a point where I was going to be formed one way or another by something and someone. And it just so happened that when I stepped in, people took my life seriously. They took their role in my life seriously, where they stepped into a gap. And we need to be able to step into gaps for young people. And I think also one thing that I've seen recently, and I think it has a part to play, because I don't think there's any one answer on its own.
Definitely not.
I certainly think if we're going to elevate anything, we elevate the prayer and worship and the word and those things. We need to. But I've also engaged recently with an organization that's reaching young people, and they're called Start to Stir. And they basically say, okay, well, where are young people at? And whereas before, what a church might do is, there's nothing wrong with this, it's good, but they might say, okay, our young people have grown up in church, let's do Youth Alpha, or let's do a youth discipleship track, and fantastic stuff and brilliant. But what this organization says, well, actually, maybe our young people are not ready for that yet. Maybe our young people need to be engaged in a way where they begin to even realize that there's life beyond the natural. We've got a soul, a spirit, however you want to see it. And how do we engage with them to show them that there's life beyond what they see, the material and the natural? And they've developed a course where they connect with young people in schools and communities, where they begin to say, okay, what is this invisible part of you, your personality, your spirit, your yearning, your all this stuff? How do we feed that? How do we see that as a reality? And they're beginning to reach out to young people like that. And I think that's an authentic question to answer in this day and age. So I think we need to be able to answer the questions that they're asking in some way, but at the same time, we need to recognize that the only true thing that we offer that the world doesn't is a relationship with the triune, eternal, all-powerful creator. And we can't substitute that for games and activities and fun. That should come as part of what it means to serve God.
So you're trying to tell me that you can't, how about wealth and health and stuff like that? Could that not substitute it? No.
No. No, I mean, this is the thing, is that I think God cares about that stuff. I think God cares about our finances. I think God cares about our body. I mean, he created us and said it is good. Like, he cares about those things. But at the same time, I think life has showed us personally, and we have to look around us, that you can pursue all those things. And just like Jesus said to the woman at the well in Samaria, you're jumping from wife to wife, husband to husband, relationship to relationship, and you're still thirsty. And he says, but I've got something for you where you'll thirst no more. And I think that's the only answer ultimately. And I think the other stuff we pay attention to, of course, we want to have fun as Christians. Gosh, I'm not one of those people. I think Jesus had fun. I think Jesus knew how to smile and laugh. I don't think he didn't for a second. But all of that joy and peace came out of the relationships we had with him and with his people, not because we had gained a certain amount of money. It's not enough.
Right. So I want to keep it specific to becoming a pastor. But say, for example, you've got a young person in front of you and they want to be a pastor and they're looking for some advice. And I guess that the main worries are, am I going to be able to provide for my family?
Mm-hmm.
Am I even capable? Do you get me? Like, do I meet the standard? That kind of thing. Maybe all these exams, am I going to be able to pass it? Do I know enough about the Bible? You meet. Well, that's one set of their worries, I guess. Or like, even, am I going to be able to manage enough time with my family and the church? Those conflicts. Is it too busy? Like, what would you say to that person? But also, just in terms of someone that, like, maybe also a young pastor just beginning, what kind of advice would you give them?
Right.
No pressure. No,
just a few different scenarios. I'd say the first thing is even though the journey to becoming a pastor, say in this context, could maybe on the sound of it sound quite stringent, like quite a lot happening. What is beautiful about the journey is that you're never put in that position, also say firstly, unless you really sense that God's calling you to it, and secondly, the pastor and the ministry are there with you on the journey. It's not like, right, there's the exam, there's this, there's that. It's like, okay, let's go on this journey together. Yes, you need to study, but you should do that anyway, pastor or not. Do you know what I mean? Like, that would be the hope that everyone would do that. And so I think that the journey is done together in that sense. So educational background and all those things are not the be all and end all. From our ministry, we have people that are pastors that are from every type of lifestyle. You mean, you've seen some of it, every type of lifestyle you could imagine. And some of them are educated and some of them aren't. And I think, you know, that's got no bearing on intelligence. You know, you can be very intelligent and have a great education. And so I think on that side of things, that's always manageable. It really is. I think in terms of a young kind of person that's maybe looking at, you know, wanting to understand about what that journey looks like and whether they could do it, the first question I'd ask anyone is, take the pastor title out of it. There's two things I'd want to know, and two things that any person should come to anyway. One is, forget the title. Are you willing to love and serve people selflessly? Again, that's not just reserved for the pastor, but I would ask them that question. Are you willing to do that? Because that's what it takes to be a shepherd in God's kingdom, is to love and serve selflessly. Even when you don't get the pats on the back and the awards and the, you know, what an amazing job you're doing, they don't come often. So
can I ask, have you felt that yourself as a pastor kind of thing? Because do you know what? So like in uni, I did like a little Bible study fellowship group. And even I, in that little thing, sometimes felt like these people don't appreciate what like the time and effort I'm putting into this, you know? Like,
you know what?
like
Yeah,
sometimes nobody comes, and it's like, what's going on?
Oh, totally. Like that's a part of a reality. And I would imagine that that's how the Apostle Paul felt. I'd imagine that's how Moses felt when they wanted to stone him 3 days after coming out of Egypt. And it's like, you know what I mean? Like he's probably there like, Lord, I've just literally was the first one to walk into that Red Sea. And now 3 days later, we've got out of it and they're already ready to turn on me. Like, I think you have to be ready for God to meet your needs in anything in life. That works for marriage, that works for parenting, it works for anything. But in this context of being a pastor, you have to be ready for God to be the one that meets your needs. Now, you'll get moments and times, like I got a message about 10 years ago, which I hold on to now, where we worked with a young person for a few years. She had fled from a country that was going through civil war, and she came into London, and we worked with her, and we brought her into our home, practically lived with us. And then all of a sudden, after about 2 years, she disappeared. And I was like, no. And then about 7 years later, we just got a message on our Facebook from her saying that she was about to get married to like a pastor's child. She had graduated university as a nurse in Toronto and all this stuff. And she was like, I've never forgotten anything you've done. Now, that for me was like, that really touched me, because sometimes you don't know the fruit of your labor. Sometimes you don't know what's going to come from what you do. And I think it says it in Hebrews, where God says that he is faithful to remember every act of love you show in his name towards his children. And I hold on to that, because I'm like, I'm loving people and serving people. And sometimes I make mistakes, but I'm loving people and serving people as well as I can. You don't always get the response. It doesn't mean that people aren't always thankful, but people don't always show it. People don't always say it. And I'm sure there's people that I don't show my gratitude to enough. But yeah, you have to be ready for God to meet your need. That's one of the biggest things about answering the call of God, is, are you ready for God to be the one that meets your need? Because people won't do it. And even you can get married and sometimes your husband and wife won't do it. It can only be God. If you get married and you're waiting for your wife or husband to make you happy, you're going to be in trouble. Like, it's God that does that. It's always our relationship with God that does that. So that's, go on, yeah, go for it.
No, sorry, I was just gonna say I think that's probably the same answer for someone that might be thinking like, am I gonna be able to provide for my family, or would I be able to still have time for my family and all that kind of stuff? Like if I go down this journey, it's just the idea of like God is gonna provide for you as well.
Yeah, I would say there's probably two things to that. I would say one, you probably do need to, why Jesus would talk about counting the cost. You know, you start building a tower, I think Jesus said, when you realize halfway through you've not got the resources to finish it, so you stop. And Jesus is like, probably count the cost first. So there's an element of entering into this kind of reality of full-time ministry or pastoring or that type of context, where you have to count the cost and say, okay, there's probably going to be elements of this journey and times in this journey where it is going to be by faith. I might not have access to the same resources that other people do. And there is a reality, and I wholeheartedly believe that some things that pastors do, if they were to go and get a job anywhere else, they'd be paid a lot of money. But because of their vocation, they don't. That's part of it. The other part of it, I would say, and it's one thing I wish I'd learned, if you want to know anything about the mistakes that I feel I made when I was younger, one of the things that I wish I'd done when I was younger is been a lot wiser and a lot smarter about how to use finance and how to use the money that I did have, and how to invest and how to do these things, not from a worldly perspective, but the Bible doesn't say there's anything wrong with wealth. It's how you treat it, your relationship with it, and how you view it. And so I think that if I could go back in time, I would say to a young up-and-coming minister or a young pastor, whatever it might be, make wise choices about your work, about your income, about your finance. Make good, spiritual, wise choices, because you can still do a lot with a little if you're making good decisions. I don't think I did that when I was younger, and I'm only really doing it over the last few years. So I think there's also a responsibility on the individual to live wisely, as well as recognizing there's probably going to be times where you're not getting what you could get somewhere else.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that. I appreciate this so much, and thanks for your time and thanks for your patience. And yeah, like it's definitely you said it was a privilege for you, it's a privilege for me, man. Like I promise you, and this has been amazing. I've learned so much. And
Hopefully I didn't preach too much.
Nah, never. Not to me anyway. But yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for that. Yeah, like even when I asked you, you didn't really ask too many questions, and that's a credit to you. And I hope that when I grow up, I'll be more like you as well.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I appreciate it, man. I'm like, you know, from the first time I met you, you know, you've got a great spirit. By the grace of God, you've got a good spirit, and you've got a heart for the word, and you've got a heart to make an impact, and that's a beautiful thing. So, you know, I didn't really have to think twice when you asked me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
No problem, man. No problem at all.